Well, the most important news of the day before what we just learned about the Jack Smith report, and possibly still the most important news of the day, is the simple fact that no supporters of Kamala Harris attacked the Capitol today to try to prevent the counting of electoral votes. That is something that happens only on the other side of our politics, and only with a very tiny percent of Trump supporters. Democrats have never done it, never attacked the Capitol. Republicans did it once, 4 years ago. And so we can reset the clock on peaceful transfer of power. We are now in the midst of our very first peaceful transfer of power since our only violent transfer of power 4 years ago. We moved from presidency to presidency for 232 years before Donald Trump became the first president to actively disrupt the peaceful transfer of power by telling his supporters to go to the Capitol and fight like hell. Donald Trump faced a federal indictment that Jack Smith has written a report about for his conduct on January 6th and for his weeks of criminal conduct leading up to that day, according to the indictment, returned against him by a grand jury and pursued by special counsel Jack Smith, who has now summarized that case and those findings in his report, what is reported to be tonight in the breaking news of the night, a 2-volume report written by Jack Smith that the Trump lawyers are now desperately trying to block from ever becoming public. The Justice Department and Jack Smith withdrew that prosecution of Donald Trump for his activities on January 6th when Donald Trump won the presidential election because of a Justice Department policy to not prosecute current presidents of the United States. Those charges could be filed again against Donald Trump when he is no longer president. When future historians read that indictment, and if they get to read the Jack Smith report, this is what they will find.
The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. These facts require immediate action by President Trump. Accept his share of responsibility, quell the brewing unrest, and ensure President-elect Biden is able to successfully begin his term.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president.
That is what the Republican leadership of Congress thought and said 4 years ago. Donald Trump was responsible. Now, Republicans want you to forget all of that. In an op-ed piece in the Washington Post today, President Biden wrote, quote, "We should commit to remembering January 6, 2021 every year, to remember it as a day when our democracy was put to the test and prevailed, to remember that democracy, even in America, is never guaranteed. The one thing that we thought was guaranteed about government in America was democracy. And now we know better. Now we have the proof in the last 2 January 6ths that one party respects democracy, win or lose, and one party does not. The particulars of what we saw today, we have seen only a couple of times before. It has occurred only 3 times in the lifetimes of even the most senior viewers of this program. The current vice president, who ran for president and lost, presiding over the Electoral College count in Congress on January 6th. Vice President Richard Nixon had to do that on January 6th, 1961, when he lost to President John F. Kennedy.
Members of the Congress, The state of the vote for President of the United States, as delivered to the President of the Senate, is as follows. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 537, of which a majority is 269. John F. Kennedy of the state of Massachusetts has received for President of the United States 303 votes. Richard M. Nixon of the state of California has received 219 votes. Harry F. Byrd of the state of Virginia has received 15 votes.
The first time most of us saw this process was on January 6, 2001, when the candidate who got the most votes for president, Al Gore, had to preside over an electoral college count that would give the presidency to Republican George W. Bush.
The state of the vote for President of the United States, as delivered to the President of the Senate, is as follows. The whole number of the electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538, of which a majority is 270. George W. Bush of the state of Texas has received for President of the United States 271 votes. Al Gore of the state of Tennessee has received 266 votes.
It doesn't get closer than that. It was an agonizing loss for Al Gore. No matter what you thought of Al Gore, you couldn't help but admire him more after he was then forced by oath of office to perform the most difficult official duty a vice president can carry out. It was Kamala Harris's turn today. There are now exactly 2 people in the world who know what it feels like to do that as vice president with the whole world watching, Al Gore and Kamala Harris. There is no greater professional loss than the loss of a presidential campaign. There is nothing bigger on this earth that you can compete for, and so there is no more difficult defeat to bear. In politics, defeat is one of the most important public tests of character. Donald Trump failed that test more miserably 4 years ago than any politician in American history. Today, the Vice President of the United States, to the surprise of no one, handled her duty with grace and dignity and with a frequent smile. Kamala Harris was, on this day in American history, the personification of the return of the peaceful transfer of power. It was in her role as the top Democrat on the Senate Rules Committee that Senator Amy Klobuchar shared the duty with the new Republican chair of that committee and Republican and Democratic members of the House of reading the electoral vote tallies in individual states to the Congress. 4 years ago, Republican senators and Republican members of the House objected to the vote tallies that today were received as routine.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Arizona seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 11 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 11 votes for vice president.
It was so routine and back to normal and good-natured today that Senator J.D. Vance, knowingly or absent-mindedly, found himself clapping even for states Kamala Harris won.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Minnesota seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Kamala D. Harris of the state of California received 10 votes for president, and Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota received 10 votes for vice president.
And that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's the way it was. Every time, every single time. Except once. the time Donald Trump tried to stop the count with the help of a Trump mob attacking the Capitol, an attack that Donald Trump watched on television in the small presidential dining room off the Oval Office and did nothing as President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, to stop the attack on the Capitol. 187 minutes of doing absolutely nothing was proved by the January 6th committee's investigation of Donald Trump. The one thing Donald Trump continued to do on January 6th was try to change the minds of Republican senators so that they would vote against certifying Joe Biden's win. 4 years later, a half hour before the congressional session began today, the President of the United States was on his way out of town to New Orleans to grieve with the people there who lost loved ones in a terrorist attack that killed 14 people carried out by a former sergeant in the United States Army.
I know it's been 5 days staring at that empty chair in the kitchen, around the kitchen table, and not hearing the voice. You think of the birthdays, the anniversaries, the holidays to come without them. You think of everything, everyday things, the small things, the details you'll miss the most. The morning coffee you shared together, the bend of his smile, the perfect pitch of her laugh. The rest of America has learned about them as well. Students who dreamed of becoming engineers and nurses, star athletes who worked on Wall Street or helped coach small children, warehouse managers, bluegrass fan, cook engaged to be married, a single mom just promoted at work and teaching her young son to read. They came from different states, even different countries. There were children at dinner with their parents, before joining their friends on New Year's Eve. Some even ran toward the chaos to try to help save others. We remember them.
Hours before the president spoke today in New Orleans, at the Capitol, when all the electoral votes were tallied today, the Vice President of the United States played her part in the peaceful transfer of power.
The state of the vote for the President of the United States, as delivered to the President of the Senate, is as follows. The whole number of the electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, the majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio has received 312 votes. Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota has received 226 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected, President and Vice President of the United States. each for a term beginning on the 20th day of January 2025, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the House and the Senate. Thank you very much. Of the joint Senate having been concluded pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution Number 2, the 119th Congress, the chair declares this joint session dissolved. Thank you.
And so for the first time since Barack Obama was President of the United States, the President of the United States today did nothing to try to stop the peaceful transfer of power. For the first time since Barack Obama was President, the President of the United States today did nothing on January 6th that would get him impeached a week later in the House of Representatives. In his article in the Washington Post today, President Biden wrote, "For much of our history, this proceeding was treated as pro forma, a routine act. But after what we all witnessed on January 6, 2021, we know we can never again take it for granted."